Welcome to the Medicine and Science podcast from the BMJ. I'm Rebecca Coombs, Head of Journalism, standing in for Cameron Abbasi. This week, a measles outbreak in Liverpool has led to the death of a child.
But this is the tip of the iceberg. This tragic event is the tip of the iceberg because for this one child to have died, that meant many others had had measles and many others hadn't had the vaccine.
If you've been in a high street pharmacy or supermarket recently, chances are you'll have seen home testing kits for all sorts of medical info. We hear from the authors of new research revealing serious concerns about the reliability of these home tests.
And we saw some very, very strange and probably not evidence-based lists of the sorts of reasons why somebody should look at one of these tests.
I'm joined now in the studio by the BMJ's assistant news editor, Gareth Iacobucci. Hi, Gareth.
Hi, Bex.
You've been reporting on this story about the measles outbreak in Liverpool. And we know, sadly, there's been a case of one child dying. What else can you tell us about this story?
So what we know at the moment is that a child died in the week of 15th of July, having been admitted to the intensive care unit with other serious health problems. The trust in question, Alder Hey Children's Hospital, has said that it has treated 17 children since June for measles symptoms and complications. And the trust has been really keen to stress that parents really, the importance of them vaccinating their children against measles. It said it was particularly worried about children who are already in hospital for other reasons, contracting measles.
Mm. And what is the official data telling us about the national picture?
So, according to UK HSA, there have been 529 lab-confirmed cases in England this year, and that's between, I think, 1st of January and 25th of June. And around 12% were in the northwest, which is obviously where the Liverpool Trust is. I think also, for context, the 2024 had a very, very high number as well. So this is sort of a trend, a worrying trend, I think you could describe it.
I suppose the next obvious question is to talk to you about the uptake of the 2-dose MMR vaccine. Can you tell us a bit about the trend in uptake? Yes.
So I think last year, for which we have data, which is 2023-24, coverage for both doses, so a full dose of the MMR at age 5 went down to 84%. Now, that's the lowest number for 15 years. So wow. It's a real issue. And I think Liverpool had uptake in Liverpool was lower than that, at around 73%. But for context, even England as a whole is far below what the WHO recommends for herd immunity, which is 95%.
So it seems that it's falling year on year, and it has been falling for many years then, the 2-dose vaccine.
Yes, that's what the data tell us.
What explanations do we have for this? Is there a sort of generational difference that the parents, young parents today, they don't know what it's like when measles was a sort of serious issue? There's no memory there.
Yes, I think that could be definitely part of it. I think there are probably multiple factors involved. And I spoke to Steve Turner, who's the president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, about this, to sort of ask him, what he thought. He did mention that the issue of vaccine hesitancy, but we also discussed, real barriers in accessing vaccines as well. So I think if you sort of take those things in the round, his point really was that the health service really need to sort of redouble their efforts to try and improve vaccination rates.
I think actually, as you said, you spoke to Stephen. I think we might be able to hear from him now.
We've heard the story about what's happened in Liverpool with the reports that a child has died from measles. I wanted to ask for your reflections on that, really, and I guess how concerned you are about the sort of re-emergence of measles in this country.
Well, you can probably tell what I'm going to say. That has to be a never event. The introduction of measles, mumps, rubella has made a profound difference. My dad's a long-retired GP. He talks about the days where, he remembers when I had measles. So it's obviously a tragedy for that family. Losing a child is an unspeakable event. But this is the tip of the iceberg. This tragic event is the tip of the iceberg, because for this one child to have died, that meant many others had measles, and many others hadn't had the vaccine. And we have this curious business where, going into COVID, everybody wanted the vaccine. Everybody wanted vaccines. But what we have seen in children in particular, but I think across the whole of the population, there's a reduced enthusiasm for, there's an increased suspicion of, there's more vaccine hesitancy, which is a curious thing that I don't fully understand. But the simple message that vaccinations save lives is as important now as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it saddens me to hear about this case, not just for the family, but also what it means that we're doing and what we're failing to do as a society to protect our children. And by golly, we need to do more. And hopefully this tragic case will be seen as a turning point.
Well, thanks, Gareth. I'm sure you're going to be keeping a close eye on this story as it continues to develop.
Hi, it's Duncan, the producer here. We just wanted to drop in one extra bit of information for you into this podcast. A little while ago, the BMJ published a How to Recognise and Manage Measles practice article, and we spoke to the author to get us some top tips.
My name is Fran Dutton. I am a GP. I work in Birmingham, and I also work in the emergency department at Birmingham Children's Hospital.
And Fran, we asked you on because with this new outbreak that we're seeing in the UK, it's become apparent that it could be hard for some people to identify measles. And as the author of our practice article on doing that, we thought it was a good idea to invite you on. So many doctors may never have seen measles in their careers.
And I guess I'd also extend that with not just doctors, but people. So I think if you rewind 100 years ago, measles would have been looked after predominantly by families at home, and you would have recognised what measles was. I think the whole world knew what measles was. So now we're all a bit naive to it. Luckily, it does have a pattern, so you can recognise it. And the more you see, obviously it gets easier, but I'm happy to talk through what that looks like today, if you'd like. So measles generally has an incubation period of somewhere typically 10 to 14 days, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, but typically 10 to 14. And after that time, the child will develop fever and 3 Cs, which you'd have heard of, which is cough, coryza, and conjunctivitis. Now, in itself, this can be maybe a challenging time to identify measles because actually there's lots of illnesses, typically viral infections, which feature cough, coryza, and fever. Something that can really help the diagnostic certainty at this point is the presence of Koplik spots on the buccal mucosa. Now, this can be quite hard to identify because you obviously need quite a good look at the inside of the cheek to be able to see this, but it's really worth persisting. So the Koplik spots can become evident 1 to 2 days before the rash evolves. Now, when the rash evolves, you really start to notice that. The rash starts typically behind the ears and it will move kind of southwards, so it will move down the body, and it's often quite a dramatic rash. So families don't miss that. Now, I guess the reason we talk about the importance of identifying the infection and recognizing it is that measles is pretty sneaky. Measles is contagious, so you can spread it from 4 days before the onset of the rash until 4 days after the onset of the rash. So I think from what we've talked about, you can see that it's actually quite possible to spread it before you know it's measles. So in those initial days before the rash comes out, you may just have cough, coryza, fever, conjunctivitis and think, oh, this is a typical viral infection, but actually you're contagious and spreading measles.
We know of the efficacy of the MMR vaccine, but there is going to be a cohort of adults who were too old to get it routinely as kids, but who may not have been exposed to measles. Now, we've been speaking about children here, but are there other populations we need to be worrying about?
Yeah, so everyone. You're absolutely right. So measles can affect everyone. And we saw that in our outbreak in Birmingham last year. It did affect all ages of people. But if you looked at the graphs, it affected many, many more in terms of numbers of younger children. But in the UK, I don't know about the rest of the world, but in the UK, it's absolutely good practice to offer MMR vaccination to anyone who has not had 2 vaccines reported and is uncertain as to whether they've had measles infection in the past. So I'd certainly encourage anyone who's not sure to go to your GP, and that would absolutely be good practice to have your MMR vaccination. It's typically assumed that most people born before 1980 are measles immune, because at that point, measles virus was circulating widely in our population. But you're right, there'll be some adults who have not been exposed to it. And yeah, I'd encourage everyone, go to your GP, get the MMR vaccine. It's safe and really effective at preventing measles.
So if there are clinicians out there who see a case of measles, not necessarily in hospital, perhaps just in their GP practice, what should they do?
So when you have identified a suspected measles case, it is absolutely your duty to be able to convey that to the family so that they understand the value that child does not go to the shop, to the library, to school, to anything like that. They stay at home, safe with their family. And if they need to be escalated to hospital care, which may well happen, you telephone the hospital in advance, warn them so that they know that they're going to need to isolate this child. You need to inform UCSA, the UK Health Security Agency, so that they can send out the testing kits in the post if that's what's done in your local area. But I need you to read up on that local guidance about how you notify UCSA of potential cases, how you as your GP can identify vulnerable contacts. It's really important if you've got an index case with you and they are in contact with a vulnerable individual, so possibly that's an infant under 6 months, a pregnant woman who hasn't had measles or MMR, and someone in their family may be immunocompromised. It's really important you highlight that to UCSA immediately so that they can enable that family to have choices about post-exposure prophylaxis and keep them safe.
Today we're asking, just how safe are those self-testing kits you can buy in the supermarket alongside your toothpaste? From fertility to thyroid to vitamin D, a flood of kits has arrived on the UK shelves. But new research published in the BMJ finds that many of these kits are poorly supported, confusing and unsuitable for home use. So I'm joined by Professor John Deeks, you're Professor of Biostatistics at the University of Birmingham.
That's right.
John, you led this research. What prompted this investigation in the first place?
It originated when I went to one of the pharmacists just near the university to get a paracetamol. And I looked around and I'd seen all of these tests, which I'd never noticed before. Whilst I was there, I could see there were tests for cancer, there were tests for menopause, there's all sorts of tests, which I wasn't aware that they were in the market. And very quickly I had a look around and you could see that actually this is something which other places were starting to sell. So I talked to my team. We thought very carefully that we could investigate what the claims were of these tests. I bought one straight away to look at what's inside the box, because it's not very clear when you actually get the test until you've bought the paperwork that actually why and what information there is about that.
And then once you did that, how did you select the other kits? I should say, I think you looked at 30 different self-tests in your research. So how did you select those kits and what sort of methodology did you use?
Well, as a statistician, we have to think about our sampling. And so we had to work out our sample approach to actually make sure we got a representative set of tests. Actually, we drove 10 miles from the university and went to every supermarket, which covers more or less every mainstream supermarket in the UK.
I bet, yeah.
And we also looked at the pharmacists, not for independent pharmacists. We went for the mainstreams, which are, where there's a brand. Looking back, we can see that we've actually got a very representative sample of nearly all of the tests which are available in the UK at that point.
John, can you just give us a brief summary of the types of tests that you've been sampling?
So I think of our 30 tests, they were covered from about 19 different conditions.
Right.
So some of these were cancer tests. So there was prostate cancer, bowel cancer. There was infectious diseases. There was COVID, flu, chlamydia, and then there were other tests for hormone things, for infertility, male infertility, and then there were some what you might describe as wellness markers, so things like vitamin D, thyroid, and iron.
A huge range then. You didn't mention pregnancy tests.
No, we actually excluded pregnancy tests, and we did that because they're well established. They're actually part of the NHS planned programs for people to use. So we didn't include pregnancy tests, and it would be bad for our research to be thought about as a reason not to use a pregnancy test because they've been well established.
Important point. Yeah. And the tests you've just mentioned then, are they the same ones as we might find in the NHS, but adapted for home use?
No, I think most of the time in the NHS, if you took a blood sample, it will be sent to the laboratory, which will be using a larger machine, which will be measuring the concentration of whatever the biomarker is. That's not the same structure as used for a lateral flow test, which gives a positive, negative result. So it's important, I think, if you had your cholesterol measured by the GP, you get a number which tells you what the concentration is, and the GP will be looking at the reference range to decide whether that's abnormal or normal, and that will be adapted for different tests according to your age, to your gender, etc., like that. And of course, the lateral flow tests, they don't have that technology. Some of the tests allow you to tell the difference between a small number of categories, which are all done by the colour size, the colour concentration of that, but more or less all of them are all just binary decisions. So that's not the same
Negative
technology.
And positive.
Yeah.
And so you came back with this huge shopping basket of tests, and what surprised you by what you found?
Well, the first thing is the instructions. So as soon as you get one of the tests, you want to understand why you're going to use this test. Are you the right person to use the test? When you should do it? How to do it? And what's the actions that you're going to take afterwards? So during the COVID pandemic, we were looking at the Department of Health's test, and the paperwork for that was very clear as to how it is and who should use this test and what does a positive mean and what does a negative mean.
So this would be like a lateral flow test?
Most of these are lateral flow tests. That some of them have got other technologies behind them, but most of them were lateral flow tests.
So you've seen a good example of how to do instructions for use?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And, we talked a lot during the COVID time to make sure that people who got a negative test for the COVID test were aware that doesn't mean that it was a clear thing that they definitely don't have COVID. That was part of the discussion we were part of. So we'd looked at this very carefully. So we wanted to see whether the same thoughts had gone into these other self-tests which are now on the market.
And what did you find?
That they're not, is the main thing. That the actual presentation of them is very, very poorly thought through, that it's not even clear as to whether this is a diagnostic test or a screening test or a monitoring test, why it is that this should be done, who should use it. If you think about the COVID thing, you were very clear as to what symptoms somebody might look at to decide whether you should have a COVID test. And so we're looking at the lists on there to say, what are the symptoms for these tests? And we saw some very, very strange and probably not evidence-based lists of the sorts of reasons why somebody should look at one of these tests.
So even at the point of sale, when I'm standing in front of a probably quite bewildering array of tests in a supermarket, there isn't something instantly or clearly which allow me to decide if that test is for me or not.
Absolutely. And so the box, so what's on the box question, it's interesting to look at these because some of them are very unclear.
Could you give me an example of one where it's particularly problematic in terms of the packaging?
Well, the packaging, quite a lot of them just name the biomarker.
Right.
And it's not that clear as to what it is that you're going to learn from having this test or whether you should use it at all.
Right.
Some of them are telling you about a medical condition. So there are menopause tests which mention menopause on them, but it's not clear as to should you use this when you're perimenopausal or whatever. And then there are others which just describe your health issues, like bowel health. And then, is that really talking about bowel cancer? It's not clear actually what it is that you're doing.
And then once you've got that test at home and you're opening it up on your kitchen table, you say, then the real problems begin when you start looking at these instructions for use leaflets.
Yeah, so the instructions for use leaflets, they're the document which is produced by the manufacturer.
Oh, right. So these are coming straight from the manufacturer themselves and they're following quite a strict format.
Yes, so the manufacturer are responsible for the test and whatever other bits of equipment, such as the sampling, whether it's for a swab or something like that, and the instructions for use. They're the three key parts of the kit. And the instructions for use are checked by the regulators, and they are always within the box. The contents may be boxed by other distributors under different names. So you might find they look different, but they're actually end up being the same test.
They're all the same test from the same factory.
Yes, and effectively the CE marking, which allows these tests to go on the market, they are based on saying this is the test and this is the instructions for use.
And so by looking at the CE mark, you should be able to be reassured that the person responsible for awarding that mark has deemed it fit for use in your home.
That's the purpose of a CE test, that it's a CE marking, whether it's for your kettle or whether it's for a lateral flow test. It's meant to have been checked to make sure that it complies with the regulations, that it's safe and it's accurate in terms of saying it does what it says.
Okay. So back to the kitchen table. I'm there with the tests, and could you just give us a sense of what you found? Some of them were problematic issues, a range of the issues that they found within looking at the instructions for use, starting off with, and then maybe we can talk about the actual kit.
So the instructions for use, we read the whole of every single document. I mean, first of all, that they're written in very difficult language. We've tried to work out how do we summarize the fact that these are not going to be easy for many consumers to understand. The way we've done that in the paper is to use numerical measurements of readability.
Right.
And so there are some standard ways in which you measure that. Of our 30 tests, we rated 10 out of the 30, so a third, which were suitable for a 13 or 14-year-old.
Right.
Some of the tests we can see actually work very well and they've been thought through, and that's fine. A number of them have not, but they're all CE marked, so a member of the public cannot tell the difference from those.
But it's not just about readability.
No.
I think there are other, what we could call usability issues that you've discovered. And I've been lucky enough to read your paper, and I can see that you talk about poor and unclear instructions, so it's actually very hard to follow step by step what you need to do.
Yes, there's one test where you basically have to add a buffer into lateral flow test at one point, but the question is whether you put a blood spot in first or do you put in the buffer first, and the instructions of the figure say it one way and the text says the other way between those. So does it matter? We don't know, but the technical people will.
But at the very least, because these leaflets have been cleared for market by a notified body in Europe, you'd expect it to be concise and consistent. Yeah, and it wasn't.
It wasn't.
No.
And whether that's from the IFU or was it from the actual printing by the distributor, we don't know from that.
And also there were some really interesting examples of sort of lab instructions for some of these tests. So they were assuming, for example, if you were taking the menopause test, it mentions a centrifuge, doesn't it?
Yes, so there were several urine tests where it says that if the sample is cloudy, you could put it in a centrifuge.
Right.
And I guess that this is possibly because these tests were originally designed to be tested in a laboratory. And so you would have a centrifuge in a laboratory, but most people don't have one in their kitchen.
No, and very confusing.
Why would you do this? It's likely that this is actually a hangover from a test being used as a laboratory test rather than as a self-test.
Yeah. We're talking about the instructions for use leaflets. And what's striking is how many of them recommend that the patient consult a doctor even with a negative result?
Yeah, nearly all of them, when they're positive, are saying you need to take medical advice, whether it's a doctor or whether it's a pharmacist. They vary a little bit. Some of them are saying, if you still have the same symptoms and you're negative, go and take medical advice from that. So that actually means that a lot of the time, if you bought this test, you would end up going to see the GP, whether you get a positive or a negative result, which you might think actually say, well, why would I buy this test?
So what's going wrong then? I mean, how are these tests getting onto the market, and what do you think the results say about the current regulatory climate?
What I think that we can observe is actually that the regulation of diagnostic tests, which are under the devices laws, is a little bit behind the time in that they haven't taken on the needs of this new use of lateral flow tests as home tests. That actually the regulations originate from what's called the IVDD, which is under the EU regulations, which is it's nearly 25 years ago before that was done. There have been new changes in the regulations which have been introduced, the IVDR as it's called, but they are being in a transition phase, which means that they're not essential at the moment, which means that some of these tests are not being checked for the right regulations. And because this is a new type of technology, they're not really fit for purpose for that. So they can get the CE marking, but they probably haven't got the right background for the full regulation process which is needed.
So would you say then that a CE mark is a reliable indicator of quality for the customer?
Probably not. When you look at the paperwork from these tests, they're not providing information for a consumer to make informed choices about a test. And that's part of the CE marking. It should be to show that these are safe and they are delivering what they should do. So it doesn't seem that they are in that right place to actually be sold in this type of setup.
John, thanks so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
The articles we've been talking about are all now available on bmj.com. That's it for this week. Cameron will be back with more medicine and science. Thanks for listening.